On January 13th, 1984, Jack walked out of his final showdown with the chairman of Commodore, Irving Gould. He would not return. Days later, it was announced to the world that Jack had quit Commodore, the company that he had built and run as his own since 1956. The global reaction was one of utter shock, with Commodore coming off their greatest single year, one where they had made over $1 billion. In other quieter quarters, some may well have said good riddance, raising a glass. Those many dealers say who were burned by Tramiel's business practices and tendency to screw people like them over. Some others inside Commodore, particularly those who saw or heard Jack's apparently climactic bust-up with Gould behind closed doors at the Winter CES show, may not have been surprised. They said that on that day, they saw Jack express an emotion that no one had ever seen up to that point: defeat. Jack Tramiel was 55 years old with a vast personal fortune. He had spent decades working like an absolute dog, like every day was his last, driving his company forward as if it were the centre of a war machine. When you grow up as he did, you take every day with the knowledge that it could all go away tomorrow. Business was never about money to Jack, it was about victory. Some may say that he took business too much to heart, to which he would agree and plough straight on harder than before. But now, he had lost. More than ever, he was aware of his age, and every one of those battles he had fought could be read in his face. He wanted to spend more time with Helen, his loving wife of 37 years. He wanted to play with his grandkids. He looked at one of his former hotshot managers, Kit Spencer of Commodore UK, who had decided to cash in his chips, take early retirement and live a life of leisure in the Bahamas, and thought, you know what, maybe there's something in that. No more Jack attacks, no more price wars, no more computers. It's time for Jack to give it a rest. Elsewhere in the US, a calamity was happening. Atari had once been the Sun Gods, the breakout company of the 1970s, and that seems like a lifetime ago. They'd never followed up the 2600, the 5200 was a failure, they'd failed to buy the Famicom, and then, thanks to a flooded market, the rise of the home computers and a total lack of control to the point where you could play 2600 games on a freaking ColecoVision, the video game market collapsed. The home computer market for Atari wasn't much better. They'd never succeeded there, with the 800 and its follow-ups lagging behind everyone else. They were winning up the rear. In 1983, the company lost $500 million. Its parent company, Warner Communications, had seen their stock price halved thanks to this. There was the distinct possibility that the failure of Atari could actually sink Warner as a whole. They were desperate to sell them off. And all the while, well, Jack had done some travelling, played with his grandkids a bit, probably slept in some, and he was bored. Life seemed to lack the breakneck pace it once had. It didn't take long at all for Jack to realise that a life of leisure wasn't really for him, and he longed to be back out there. Only a couple of months after leaving Commodore, he'd formed a new company, Tramiel Technology, his own name purposefully misspelt in order to reflect how it was actually pronounced. Their aim was, of course, the creation of a new home computer, even though by this time some could already see that the boom period of computing was heading closer to its brutal end. But then, as ever, financial sense isn't exactly the only thing that's motivating Jack. There's a couple of things in the main. This time he truly wanted his own family business, something that he would make successful and then leave to his sons, the thing that he could never have while under the thumb of Irving Gould. And of course, speaking of which, as we know, Jack couldn't ever leave a slight unanswered, let alone being forced out of the company he created. If you thought that Jack's vendetta against Texas Instruments was bad, it was nothing compared to the vendetta that Jack now had against his former company. He created Commodore, and now he's going to kill it. And so, the stars aligned. A hungry, remotivated Jack desperate to get back in the big time, and a parent company desperate to sell off their ailing former superstar. Soon their paths would cross. After not all that much negotiation, Jack Tramiel bought Atari's Consumer Electronics and Home Computer division on July 1st, 1984. It's another amazing Jack deal. Essentially, Warner all but gave the division away to Jack, with Tramiel on his end paying nothing up front, agreeing to $240 million to Warner long term and a 32% share for Warner in Tramiel technology. The then CEO of Atari, James Morgan, literally walked in the office one day to be told that Tramiel was coming into the office, so clear out all your rubbish. Atari's divisions had always worked independently of each other, and he had no desire to buy the arcade games wing of the company. Computers were his only interest. And so it made sense for Jack to buy that only and rechristen Tramiel Technology as Atari Corporation. Warner kept hold of the arcade division, but only for another year before selling it to Namco. Jack was back. The first days of Jack's command at Atari were, in a word, bloody. First off, he got together his team. Obviously, he had his sons Gary, Leonard and Sam, experts in respectively the worlds of finance, tech and management. He also had ex-Commodore people who rode with him, former members of what was dubbed his inner family, people like John Fegans, Tony Takai, and the then head of Commodore's engineering, Shiraz Shivji, made the jump directly from Jack's former company to Atari. Even before the creation of any new computer, the loss of several Commodore key figures to Tramiel was a huge right hook to the head, and shattered the already wavering confidence people had in his replacement, Marshall Smith. Remember this: for all of Jack's bad qualities and for all the people who said they would never work for him again, there were plenty of people who would in a heartbeat and did. Important people, Takai and Shivji especially, were big frickin' deals. If you want to fight a war, if you want to work for someone who you know damn well is going to drive you forwards, you go ahead and work for Jack. You'll get all the excitement and danger you can eat, and you sure as hell won't be bored with your ass on the line every single day. And at this time, Commodore were not exactly driving forwards anywhere except possibly off a cliff. Another huge punch was less direct but just as impactful, Commodore's latest dog of a computer, the Plus/4. This was actually a product started under Jack, and he's pictured with it. Presumably this was taken at that fateful Winter CES show in 1984. The Plus/4 and the rest of the 264 line, including the Commodore 16, were originally designed as very low-end business computers with productivity software built into them. But really the computer looked utterly past it in 1984, the software itself was poor, and there were serious compatibility issues with the C64. It was not a good product. The new Commodore management team inherited the computer, and Marshall Smith, with all the expertise in computers he'd built up from a lifetime in steel, thought that they should continue on with the product and treat it as a major upgrade, which it wasn't, and everyone could see that. The Plus/4 was a total failure, and it was the flooding of such wasteful products into the market that was probably one of the factors in the imminent crash of the market that we've covered already. Still, I mentioned blood. The first major mission was the reorganisation of Atari's computer division, or more accurately, the organisation of it if you consider how Atari had worked previously. Jack's lieutenants, the likes of Fegans and Leonard, went marching through every Atari building they now had. The aim? Take anyone who seems like they have a clue, and anyone else gets the chop. These were exciting times for the average Atari employee. You never knew if today would be your last day. Everyone was talking about whole buildings, once filled with hundreds of employees, now lying empty as the new management had decided there was nothing worth saving in them. And then your day comes. To take the example of just one former Atari programmer, a guy named Landon Dyer, you all get a chance to show your worth. A 5-minute interview where you're peppered with questions, either individually or as part of a group. Other than that, the lieutenants will not talk with you. You might think 5 minutes not enough time to really sell yourself, to which Jack would say, tough shit. A couple of hours later you all meet up and the lieutenants read out 2 lists of names. The longer list consists of those who'll be sleeping in tomorrow morning. The shorter list consists of those who, for now, will be working with the Tramiels. Landon was on the shorter list, and he would end up working hard on the development of the Atari ST. There were fun parts of being on that shorter list for engineers, programmers and the like. There's stories of all these bog-standard foot soldiers now happily requesting and getting the use of plushy desks and chairs that once belonged to now fired vice presidents, all sorts of things like that. But of course there would soon be the breakneck task of, in classic Tramiel style, working on a brand new computer in no time at all. This had served Jack well in the past. When he'd given folks like Chuck Peddle, Al Charpentier and Bob Yanners a mere couple of months to come up with their brand new products in the past, they'd come up with the PET and the C64. And soon enough the surviving teams at Atari would experience these joys for themselves. But first off, there is the matter of a brand new computer coming very close to falling right into Jack Tramiel's lap. Now, back in the rise and fall of the Commodore Amiga, I rather simplified the possibility of the Amiga being made by Atari, and hell, even doing that I actually managed to get it won. The truth is, the whole thing is unbelievably complex. I'm going to try my best to get through it with what I know. We're going back to the start of 1984, a time when there's a struggling company called Amiga with a strong prototype of a Motorola 68000 based computer called the Lorraine, but no one to sell it to. They're kind of close to hitting the wall. Atari, not owned by Tramiel yet, are also struggling, seeing as basically nothing they're creating is making any money. Hemorrhaging money and stuff, they're going to need to buy something in if they want to have something to plug the holes. The punitive "here's $500,000, pay us back in weeks or we'll take the computer from you" deal Amiga had was actually made by old Atari, not Tramiel. Their aim, basically, was to screw Amiga as much as possible, get them to spend that money working on the computer before they inevitably default and Atari take it. Cause how on earth were Amiga going to get that money back? Their income lay in joysticks before the Amiga came around, and that had died with the video game crash. It was like signing up to be disemboweled. Amiga had talked to various other people about their new computer, including reportedly Jack himself at one point, but Atari seemed like the only option. And then Commodore stepped in. This was perhaps one of the advantages of having a new management at the helm. Commodore, desperate enough themselves, approached things in a more genteel and supportive way, probably in a way that Tramiel, the supreme king of hardball who probably looked at Atari's original deal with admiration, wouldn't have done. And as a mark of good faith in their own negotiations with Amiga, they wrote a cheque for the $500,000. David Morse, the CEO of Amiga, promptly took the cheque to Atari personally and then immediately severed their relationship. It was a perfect move for Amiga. They'd had that money from Atari to improve their computer, they'd paid it back, and now they had no further obligations to them. Not long after this, the negotiations were completed, and Commodore buys Amiga completely for $27 million. When Jack arrived at Atari, it didn't take long for legal squabbles between him and his former company to begin. Commodore immediately sued people like Shivji for leaving and taking tech with them, which was promptly returned. Harmful, but the upshot of it all was basically that Shivji was prevented from taking up his new post for a few weeks. The eventual blows that Jack would land on discovering this old contract between Amiga and Atari would be far greater. He launched a lawsuit first against Morse and Amiga, then against Commodore and former Atari employee stroke creator of the Amiga, Jay Miner, contesting that the deal between Morse and Atari was conducted in bad faith on behalf of Morse, and that technology had been stolen from Atari in the creation of the Amiga. A brutal 2.5-year-long legal battle ensued, the results of which will never be known. However, it is believed that Atari very much came out on top, and Commodore had to pay their legal costs. Because, well, they were probably right on both counts, or certainly it was hard to legally deny both of these things. And yet you could hardly blame Amiga or Morse for it. They were up against the wall themselves against a company that was dead set on screwing them. Such are the grey areas of the courts. Anyway, that's about as much as can be said about that. By the time Jack arrived at Atari, the Amiga ship had already set sail. Instead, we ought to start looking at the creation of what would become known in the press as the Jackintosh. People have long wanted me to cover the Atari ST in more detail. It's a massive request on the channel that I'm quite happy to fulfill now. Once again, Jack offered a brutal time frame for, essentially, the creation of a new competitive computer from scratch. He wanted a working prototype for 1985's Winter CES show, which by the time reorganisation had happened and people like Shivji were put in place, was about 5 months away. However, looking at it from the management side, Tramiel's rushing was not without ground. All of Atari's existing products from the 2600 to the 8-bit computer line were dead in the water now. There was virtually no money coming in from these machines, and Jack wouldn't be able to hold out forever. Something had to come quickly, and it couldn't just be a fob-off. It had to be good, an actual signifier that Atari were alive and kicking. Realistically, the new computer had to be prototyped by January of '85, and then on the shelves by the summer if Atari were to stand a chance. So yeah, there's no pressure at all. Now, some of the more mysterious things about the computer that need to be cleaned up. What does ST stand for? Something Tramiel? Maybe even Sam Tramiel? No, it stands for 1632 because the computer ran from a 32-bit processor off a 16-bit bus. Then there's the matter of its GUI operating system, the TOS. Now, the TOS is not the TOS. It's a combination of GEM, a graphical user interface, and GEM-DOS, a regular DOS interface, both of which were made by a company called Digital Research. Originally, the plan had been to use DR's flagship product, Gary Kildall's CP/M operating system, in the ST, but coding this for the 68,000 chip and getting everything to talk with each other proved to be a huge challenge, and Atari eventually went with GEM-DOS instead. The operating system was the major stopgap in getting the ST developed on time. TOS was the end result, and it stands for Lee Operating System, although it was usually referred to as Tramiel Operating System by those on the inside. There are many weird and wonderful things about the computer, one of the strangest becoming one of its biggest advantages. The ST hit shelves with a MIDI interface right out of the box, the first computer to do this. It seems strange because normally Tramiel would never allow such fanciful things to be shipped with a computer. The philosophy always was that the computer has what it needs to work out of the box, and then anything else can be sold via expansion. It seems as though the MIDI interface was used to make easier one of the shadier practices of the typical convention dog and pony show. It wasn't uncommon for people to demonstrate the audio capabilities of their computer while working a synthesizer under the table. Still, the MIDI interface in the Atari ST meant that the computer was, for years, very popular with musicians. Suddenly, a small producer of electronic music doesn't need tons of cash to get a computer studio setup together. The ST was music friendly in other ways, and its high memory, very high for the time with 2MB and 4MB models eventually available before anyone else, meant that it could even handle sampling. It was the computer for electronic music for several years. Both Cubase and Logic, two of the world's most popular audio sequencer programs today, started out on the Atari ST. Of course, it's not surprising that such odd things would end up thrown onto the machine, given the chaotic nature of the time frame. The actual building of the computer was relatively smooth, Shivji and company handling it with ease. It is often said, of course, that they were still pretty much working on documentation they'd done for Commodore. Even if they didn't have it, those ideas were already there. But as mentioned, the tough part was getting the operating system to work. Something about CP/M and the 68,000 didn't mix at all, and it soon became clear that if they were going to work together, it would require months upon months of development. CP/M was a big name, but that was time that Atari didn't have. GEM-DOS was an altogether cruder way of doing things, but it did work. However, there would of course be jack attacks for those who'd wasted too much damn time. If it's not ready, it's not ready, and you're to blame. The end result is a capable operating system, but very buggy and crude. In the end, the initial Atari STs had to ship with the TOS on disk, which was great, especially considering that loading it up left only a few kilobytes of memory for coding and other applications. This was soon fixed, and existing STs were updated free of charge. Somehow, almost on the day of the CES show itself, the programmers at Atari managed to get GEM onto the ST and show it off, where reviews were very positive. Basically, the Atari ST is a very good computer indeed. I always say that if I had the ST instead of the Amiga, I would happily be a big fan of it. It's a lovely little thing, with many good qualities. It has its own quirks like every other machine, but if the question is the Atari ST a capable computer that's worthy of fighting the soon-to-come Amiga, as well as the Macintosh and all other computers of the time? Well, the answer is a definite yes. Now though, we have to get to the nitty-gritty of selling the thing, and then go into war. Power without the price. the new Jack Tramiel slogan, and one that could hardly be argued with. The Atari ST provided power that was right up there with the Apple Macintosh, along with the GUI and so forth that was steadily becoming more popular, and it did it at the cost of $999, including a colour monitor. That's way less than half of the cost of the likes of the Macintosh Plus, machines that will set you back around $2,500. Another good thing to say about Tramiel: his marketing slogans are never fully bullshit. There's a solid kernel of truth to most of them. While Jack Tramiel never actually went to all-out war with Apple in the way he'd done with TI and was about to do with Commodore, he was always happy to compare their products with his. Indeed, the original GEM operating system was very similar to that of the Lisa, to the point where Apple sued Digital Research. However, the Atari version of GEM wasn't included in that, and that GEM was allowed to remain quite similar to the Mac's operating system. Okay, I say there isn't bullshit about the slogans, although there is a little bullshit in the way that the ST and such computers are marketed that should be addressed, just so we know full well where these machines stand. If you watch enough Commodore or Atari adverts from the Tramiel era, you'll notice how often their computers are compared to Apple's of the time, or the IBM PC. It helps to compare those computers to them, as they are the high end of, respectively, the creative and business markets, and computers being what they are, there's always going to be some numbers that compare pretty well. But of course, things like memory, or power in this instance, aren't the only things that make a computer. Hell, numbers aren't everything at all. The software is where it really counts in many ways. But it is good for the home user to feel like they're getting something comparable with the business computers. But in the eyes of big business, the likes of Commodore and Atari, hell even Apple, weren't ever serious business computers. They lacked the serious business software image, or more importantly, the established business operating system. The fact is, back in the 1980s, a computer with a GUI was not actually taken all that seriously. They were seen as toys by big business. The GUI often took a lot of the computer's power to one too, meaning they were also too slow for purpose. No, for a lot of businesses, the only system that would do was MS-DOS, and to a much lesser extent CP/M, and that was one of the IBM PC's most crucial advantages. It would take until Windows 3.1 for this image to really change. We'll get back to software soon, as on the other end of that spectrum, the Atari ST would end up seriously falling down here. But for now, it wasn't long before the Atari ST acquired the Jackintosh nickname, and it wasn't exactly a derogatory one. Gradually, even in a shrunken computer market, the ST was becoming the standout player on the convention circuit in the first half of '85, always impressing at its demonstrations. Commodore, on the other hand, seemed to be taking things slower. Their main product currently was the Commodore 128, their final 8-bit machine. This was everything that the 264 wasn't, an actual meaningful upgrade of the old C64, including, at long last, an update of the BASIC that every Commodore computer had used since 1977. It wasn't exactly a computer that looked to the future, but the C128 was a nice way to say goodbye to the 8-bits. And it sold well, managing to gather a couple of million units even in these difficult times. The Amiga was now a mystery. It had absolutely staggered the crowds at the 1984 Winter CES show, where the bouncing ball had shown the crowd things thought impossible. But after that, it had all gone quiet. The continued development of the machine was under wraps, and Commodore refused to show their hand. The 1985 Winter CES show passed with virtually no Amiga present. The summer, though, would be different. The Amiga finally kicked into gear at the summer 1985 CES show, with a largely complete A1000 ready to go. The old demos, bouncing ball and the like, were still impressive, but so were most of the other things that the computer could do. For those in attendance, it was stunning. The machine had long been dubbed as the computer of the future, and, well, it fit the billing. A full launch wasn't far behind, taking place at the Vivian Beaumont Theatre in New York with Andy Warhol drawing Debbie Harry. Before finally the Amiga started shipping in September. But things would go pretty badly from then on out for Commodore. It was their intention to sell the Amiga in specialist computer stores, to do away with the mass-market toy-based image they'd had under Tramiel, and to treat the Amiga like the special product it was. But those computer stores could hardly forget what had happened the last time they'd had dealings with Commodore. Again, another delayed punch in the face. Tramiel's terrible treatment of retailers meant that a sizable amount of them weren't interested in dealing with Commodore again, even though Tramiel wasn't at the helm. It was also $500 more than the ST, which didn't help matters much. And so began a lengthy war. By and large, the computers are very comparable. The Atari may well be shoddier in some regards, but it got out of the blocks a hell of a lot faster. By the way, you may well ask, how come Jack Tramiel didn't have as much trouble as Commodore did in terms of dealers and whatnot, considering his own reputation? Well, it's kind of simple. Atari, before Tramiel came in, already had a bunch of dealers, so they were working with Tramiel now whether they liked it or not. Guess who had cut ties with every single dealer before they were unceremoniously kicked out of their previous company? Yep. The Amiga just crawled out of the doors of Commodore. Even if you wanted one, you'd struggle or wait a long time to actually get one. The marketing power they once had was no longer there. Funnily enough, that left them the moment Tramiel departed. Once again, Irving Gould is probably more interested in sunning himself on his yacht. Marshall Smith can get himself out of his mess. But Smith was not Tramiel, and never could be. That much was clear. Commodore tried other things in the meantime. They released their first IBM PC XT clones, some business-oriented computers, but they weren't going to be enough. At the end of 1985, Commodore reported a brutal $237 million loss. As the computer market continued to shrink, they were amongst the very worst hit. Their share price, once at a high of $65 during Tramiel's reign, was now hitting as low as $5. And the tech papers did not make good reading, full of those anticipating the giant's inevitable downfall. In the end, Marshall Smith would take the hit. He stayed within Commodore, but in March of 1986 he was demoted to director. Gould will replace him with then North America CEO Thomas Rattigan, whose first order of business was the severe cutting of costs, anyway, anyhow, anywhere. Rattigan had done as good as he possibly could with the initial launch of the Amiga, had negotiated an injection of $135 million into the company that basically saved them from extinction, and he could have certainly been a formidable opponent. Of course, this is the point where the actual numbers of the war, the sales of the computers, start to deviate away from North America. The home computer just wasn't really a thing anymore. People had been burned too much, the market was still shrinking. Neither the Atari ST nor the Amiga 1000, as it would eventually be known, would ever find any major success in their home country. The home market was going and the business market was locked down. Nor would they find success in Japan, where the likes of NEC or Sharp dominated proceedings. While there'll be plenty of squabbling in the States, the true battleground for these two computers was in Europe, where the ST had already taken a solid lead, hitting the market first and scoring big wins in what had previously been the home of Commodore in Europe, West Germany. The Germans loved Jack, and for now, they were happy to switch their colours to the new company of their old boss. There were other markets too, such as France, where the Atari ST would forever have an iron grip. The Amiga could never match the ST in that country. In others still, there was everything to play for, but for the most part, the early days of the war are being won by the ST, thanks to the general lousy launch of the Amiga. Jack, for his part, didn't mind too much where the money was coming from. Even if the computer wasn't setting the States on fire, Atari were doing well in other areas. They could grow on that. Irving Gould, on the other hand, did mind. Rattigan, in his year as CEO, had done a great job with stabilising the ship at Commodore. He'd made the necessary cuts, had overseen a redo of the venerable C64 that saw this long-toothed veteran still shift units, he'd gradually got the company closer to the black, and he'd improved the company's standing in Europe with the help of PCs. The only trouble was that sales in the States were down, but they were down for everyone. And this was the reasoning that Irving Gould used, in 1987, to unceremoniously dump him from the company in a great suave of acrimony. This decision was even more baffling, in most people's eyes, than the one to drop Tramiel. How on earth could Rattigan be let go, after what he'd done? Rattigan himself suspected, probably correctly, that it was mostly about his personality clashing with Gould's. He was a lot more hard-nosed and, well, kind of Tramiel-esque than the likes of Marshall Smith had been, and Gould probably didn't like that. Naturally, a successful lawsuit for wrongful dismissal followed as Commodore continued to be in disarray. It might even have been because Gould was jealous of Rattigan's accomplishments, even taking exception to a cover interview that he'd given for Commodore's official magazine. What a fantastically petty man. And who takes over the reins at Commodore? Who do you think? What about the man who's truly been in control this whole time? Yep, Irving Gould's replacement CEO for Thomas Rattigan was Irving Gould. Suddenly, Tramiel and Gould are face to face on the battlefield. Well, maybe not. I doubt that Gould spent any less time in the Bahamas because of this change in position. What's more important is just what tools are coming over from the States for the war in Europe. Where's the support for our boys up front? Before his unceremonious departure, however, Rattigan had laid up the ball, and no matter the level of competence that was now going to be the norm at Commodore's management with his absence, it wouldn't take much to dunk it in. It was remarkable. Now really, there's no need to mince words. Come the end of 1986, the Amiga was virtually dead. The former Amiga Inc. team behind it had virtually all been let go as a part of both Smith's cost-cutting and Rattigan's. Production on the Amiga 1000 had effectively stopped in the summer of 1986, and whatever little sales they had were filled comfortably by their remaining inventory. The 1000, while such a revolutionary computer, was flawed in several critical ways. It lacked the expansion power required for a hardcore computer pro, and the price was too high for the home user. And it was aimed at a business market that was already locked down by IBM. It was brilliant, but a lack of focus killed it. The war against Atari, at this stage, looked to be over. If all Commodore could offer from a sales point of view was the C64's Twilight Tour and a bunch of PC clones, then Atari would ultimately win comfortably. But Rattigan's great move was essentially to split the Amiga into two. One powerful model for the professionals, another smaller model for the home. The A2000, a great deal more powerful than the original 1000, was filled with tools for the professionals, the video makers and the like, who were getting to grips with the machine. But the 500 was the model that would finally get the Amiga selling like hotcakes, a respectable computer comparable to the baseline ST at a decent price and aimed directly at the games market. Even though they'd lost many people over the years, Commodore still had amazing engineers at their Westchester plant, and they made these machines happen. Come Christmas of 1987, they would arrive. It was far from perfect, the marketing still just wasn't there, and Commodore were, in actual fact, too desperate to court the old computer shops back to their side. This was a games-oriented computer, and the computer retailers even dropped hints to Commodore that such a thing might actually benefit from a limited release onto mass-market shelves. But this didn't happen. One trouble that the A500 had in America was that a whole lot of people just didn't know it existed. Commodore's marketing was that rubbish. Oh, and as expected, Gould was basically running the company by phone from whatever tax haven he happened to be in at the time. His replacements as CEO, the likes of Max Toy and Howard Copperman, were more in the vein of Marshall Smith than Rattigan. And that's before we get to frickin' Mehdi Ali. On the side we're covering though, well, things aren't going that great. The blunt fact was that while the Atari ST had a great deal more marketing than the Amiga did, it still wasn't exactly selling in brilliant numbers, certainly not in North America. Neither computer was ever fighting for the #1 spot. Macintoshes and PC clones were always ahead of them. In Europe the Atari did better, but that was soon about to change with the arrival of the A500. The Atari had a core base of people who loved it thanks to several of its big plus points, the MIDI interface, the masses of memory it provided and what have you, but that wasn't a big user base, and as Tramiel already knew, once that user base was filled up, no one was going to be buying any more STs. Once again, the gaming market was going to provide the shift, as the Amiga 500 quickly established itself as the top gaming computer for the rest of the decade. It was so well suited to games that even more advanced Macs and the like, running off of a Motorola 68020s, could barely compete with it. In Europe, the A500 hit hard in several key markets. Commodore won back Germany, which became the machine's home again, selling hundreds of thousands of units. It would become a massive seller in the UK, selling in terrific numbers there too. The age-old Commodore practice of letting their worldwide divisions run largely autonomously paid off here, as the likes of David Pleasance created a home for the Amiga that the US executives could only dream about. It took a while to overhaul Atari's lead in Europe, and it still prospered in some countries, but ultimately, around about 1989, and thanks to the onslaught of an untold amount of entertainment packs along with games that the Atari ST just wasn't able to handle, the Amiga overhauled the ST for good. In the States, the last gasp of the Amiga happened in Christmas 1989, when the computer finally arrived on some mass-market shelves, far too late, accompanied by a big ad campaign with tons of celebrities that didn't achieve much. After that, it was basically gone. So, to sum up, the great reversal of fortune would happen in the games market. Despite being very comparable to the Amiga in many ways and usually having a lot more power, it lacked certain things that gradually people who programmed for the Amiga were able to harness more and more. The Amiga's blitter, for example, was far superior to Atari's and there from the beginning, allowing for much smoother graphics and scrolling. Horizontal scrolling in particular was something that Atari really struggled with. It took a while and there were plenty of games that became famous on both systems and were indeed fairly interchangeable. Dungeon Master, originally an ST title, is a good example. An even better example, one that ironically became one of the Amiga's flagship titles, is Bullfrogs Populist. The engine was originally created on an Atari ST, and then ported over to the Amiga during development, harnessing virtually none of the aforementioned things that made an Amiga stand out. ST port is one of the worst things you can usually say about an Amiga game, and Populous is an ST port. However, Amiga's games would eventually leave the STs standing. A good example for comparison is a rather familiar title by now, Shadow of the Beast from Psygnosis. Here's the Amiga, and here's the Atari ST. Pretty noticeable difference, isn't it? Anyway, technical differences aside, once the A500 became known as the gaming computer, that was the kiss of death. If we know anything from the likes of, say, the Dreamcast, we know this. A game's computer or console lives and dies by the people who make games for them. The A500 was able to bring all the big guns, the likes of Electronic Arts and what have you, back to Commodore, and the ST didn't have them. The Amiga had the people who could do wonderful things with the machine, and the Atari ST did not. For the big companies it became the afterthought, the system that one sad person's working on ports for in the corner, while everyone else is crowded around the Amigas and showing off their latest tech demos. The Atari could happily compete and even far outstrip the Amiga in plenty of areas, but in games, it couldn't. And as always seems to be the case, games is where it really mattered. The rest of the Amiga story is of course a tale of continued European success but ultimately stagnation, as the machine failed to be meaningfully advanced further thanks to the incompetence of Commodore's executives, including, of course, one Mehdi Ali. Ultimately, the MS-DOS machine rises thanks to the onset of better graphics cards, processors and the like, and that takes over the computer gaming market from Amiga at the start of the 90s. But what is Atari's side of this story? It had been a long and punishing war, filled with untold amounts of litigation, brutal advertising, all the hallmarks of one of the computing world's most lethal operators. But ultimately, the ST, while a really good computer, had a ceiling, and they'd reached it. Once the A500 took over the gaming market, the war was essentially lost. It was around this time that Atari started to concentrate on other consumer electronics products aside from computers. And now for Jack, well, it was time to take a back seat. He'd done what he could. He'd always wanted a family business that he could leave to his sons, and at the very least he was going to be able to do that now. And so, around the end of the 1980s, Jack Tramiel gradually left day-to-day operations at Atari, transferring them mostly to the management-oriented son, Sam. These years of Atari are of course defined largely by products that mean well, but are in many ways somewhat hamstrung and lack the commercial appeal of their betters. The Atari 7800 was something of an attempt to return the brand to the games consoles they were once known for, but it keeled over almost at the sight of Nintendo's dominance. The Atari Lynx, brought in from Epix, was in many ways a good and advanced handheld for the time, but was scuppered by way too much power consumption and once again Nintendo, this time with the Game Boy. The Jaguar tried to throw a big spanner into the bit wars of the 90s, proclaiming 64 bits at a time when such a number seemed impossible. But the fact that bits weren't everything, and that there were never enough developers on the machine side for its full power to ever even remotely be harnessed, killed the system pretty quickly. When Atari lost the games market way back when, they pretty much lost it forever. And while the ST continued to putter along, mostly thanks to Europe, ultimately that won out, and the machine was fully discontinued in 1993. In the end, the main source of income for Atari came from lawsuits. These weren't the best years, that's for damn sure. Ultimately, Jack once again found himself at the head of the company, taking the day-to-day reins back in 1995 after Sam suffered a heart attack, which he recovered from. By this stage though, all of Atari's products were failing and they weren't making any money. It was time to get out. In 1996, the Atari Corporation was effectively ended by a merger with JTS Corp, followed quickly by a sale to Hasbro for $5 million. Hasbro were the then holders of the Atari Interactive division, and their purchase of the corporation, or at least its branding, finally brought the two divisions back together again, where they were soon sold again, this time as a whole, to Infogrames. And that's roughly where we are with Atari today. After this, Jack's work got a lot lighter. He took on director roles here and there, but finally, at this stage, over 65 years old, Jack let the burners rest. He concentrated more on his role as a co-founder of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which he'd helped establish in 1993, and in which capacity he spoke of his own experiences as a survivor across the country. He happily spoke at conventions of his career in the industry, one of the highest profile figures to do so, and was free to be interviewed plenty of times about his history at Commodore and Atari. He personally dedicated a memorial stone at the museum to Vernon Tott, the soldier who he credited with liberating him from Harlem on his death in 2003. Finally, survived by Helen and his 3 sons, Jack Tramiel passed away on April 8, 2012 at the age of 83. And so we reach the end of our look at Jack Tramiel. It's certainly been interesting. He has many different qualities to him as a person, as well as several things that are pretty damn dislikable. There's a lot of things that Jack did, in particular the way that he treated some of the engineers who built those key products that got Commodore up and running in the computer business, that are pretty hard to forgive. But there's lots to admire about him too. The way that he could drive his business forward and get people to work for him utterly, and how he treated business like almost no one else. In the end though, it's utterly important to recognise the huge contribution that Tramiel made to computers the world over. After all, history is written by the winners. In this great computer story, it is common for the early achievements of the likes of Apple, of Microsoft and so forth to be celebrated over everybody else. Commodore in the end were not winners, neither were Atari. Tramiel ultimately lost. But to disregard that story, as some have done, is to deny the huge impact they made and to create a false history. For there were times when Jack Tramiel stood astride the world of computing like a colossus, however brief they may have been. It is for us now to ponder just what the world of computing would look like now if Jack had ultimately come out on top, whether it was at Commodore or Atari. That's a tough question to answer, and the answer may not even necessarily be good. But such was his status as one of the true giants of the industry, in a playground filled with such people, that everything would have been completely different. Thank you so much for watching this video, The Last Stand of Jack Tramiel. If you like this video then do consider liking it, following me on my social media, subscribing to the channel and supporting me on Patreon. I'd also like to throw a quick shout out to the Nostalgia Nerd, who has his own Atari ST story up, so between me and him we've kinda got you covered as far as Jack and the Atari and all that good stuff goes. Go to his channel and give him a subscriber, why don't you? Tell him that Kim sent you. Right, let's thank some patrons now. Seth Robinson, Jason Leach, Horo Grizzly Bar, Ian Roberts, Drew Briggs, Grayson Blackpaw, Ben Coker, Martin Pataki, Taylor Armand, Mark Johnston, Twisted Squote, Mitchell Mann, Simon Gulliver, Andy Capt, Andrew Dalton, Johan Eriksson, David Page, Conformist, Jake Elwood, Chell O'Brien, Keith Barlow, Romeo, Peter Sidorn, Grant Butler, Vishadi, Tiago Pereira dos Santos Silva, Olaf Albin, Dragon Sex Master, Joel Hartman, Phil Taprob, Jamie Hampshire, Lee Norris, Tim Lintz, Robert Kelly, Craig Nellist, James Malloy, John Davenport, Jan Velton, Olaf Jonsson, James Halliday, Marco, Gianni Giacchetta, Richard Bearwell, Hagenator, Radek, Ken Barraclough, Alvaro Gonzalez, Stephen Hornsby, Jan Best, Robin Banks, Dan Roscoe, Christian Earnshaw, Francesco Pimenta, Kev Gilmore, Alexander Green, Thomas Daniels, Greg Olson, Mark Johnson, Stuart Ashen, Lee Harris, James Idd, Novel, Gerard Morris, Mike Siegler, Mark Brooks, Russell Hugo, Paolo Leary, Graham Kamak, Scott Mittin, Nicole Ketchum, Ninth Demon, and John Ezell. Thank you all so much as ever for your fantastic support. So next time on the channel, I think it's about time that we looked at the single worst ZX Spectrum game ever made. I'm sure that's going to be fun. I'm really looking forward to taking you on that journey. But for now, it's time to say goodbye. So wherever you are and whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.